The air changed before the snow came. It always did out on the high plains of Montana. Old-timers knew it, that particular stillness, that faint metallic taste that settled on the tongue like a copper penny, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace, the kind that felt like a held breath, like the land itself was bracing. But on the evening of December 22nd, 1889, the people of Coldwater Flats were not paying attention to the air. They were paying attention to their suppers, their stoves, their children, their ledgers. They were paying attention to the things that felt solid and real and built by human hands. They were not paying attention to the sky. One woman was. She sat alone on the north face of Sentinel Ridge, inside 4 stone walls sunk 8 feet into the earth, beneath 2 feet of living sod, beneath 10 feet of packed Montana snow. A single brass tap dripped softly into a tin basin. A cast-iron stove exhaled a gentle, even warmth. A bay roan horse named Roan shifted contentedly in the adjoining stable, his breath rising in slow, unhurried clouds. The woman's name was Eleanor Voss. She was 38 years old. She was a widow. And while the town of Coldwater Flats had spent 6 months calling her foolish and grieving and dangerous and mad, she sat in the warmth she had built with her own 2 hands, and she listened to the wind begin its approach. And she felt something that was not quite peace and not quite sorrow and not quite fear. She felt ready. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the woman on the ridge, you must first understand the June morning when everything began. The land office in Coldwater Flats smelled of pipe tobacco, mildewed paper, and the particular sourness of a man who considered bathing a quarterly obligation. Mayor Aldous Crane sat behind a desk that seemed designed to communicate his authority. It was large. He was larger. His stomach preceded him into every conversation, and his opinions followed close behind, equally immovable, equally vast. He was looking at a woman he did not take seriously. This was not unusual. Aldous Crane did not take most women seriously. He took them as Weeze's cooks, as fixtures in pews on Sunday mornings. He did not take them as petitioners standing in his office on a Tuesday in June holding a rolled map and a dead man's journal, asking to purchase the most useless parcel of land in the entire county. Eleanor Voss did not flinch under his gaze. She had been flinched at before. She had learned that flinching cost you ground, and she had very little ground to spare. She unrolled the map onto his desk. Her finger found Sentinel Ridge without hesitation. She had studied this map so many times the contour lines had embedded themselves behind her eyes. The north face, she said, all of it, from the tree line to the summit. Crane leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. He peered at the map, then at her, then back at the map, as though he suspected the paper itself of some deception. Mrs. Voss, he said in the careful tone of a man explaining an arithmetic to a child, that parcel hasn't had a serious buyer in 20 years. The sun doesn't reach the north face for half the year. Snow accumulates to depths that make access impossible. Nothing grows there, nothing of value anyway. He leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach. With respect to your late husband, God rest him, I have to ask, what on earth do you want with it? Eleanor did not answer immediately. She had learned that too, that silence held long enough had weight, that it could shift the balance of a room. When she spoke, her voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she had nothing to rehearse. She simply knew. My husband was a geological surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad, she said. He spent 11 years mapping this territory. He kept journals. She placed the journal on the desk beside the map. In the winter of 1884, he documented a geothermal spring on the north face of Sentinel Ridge. It runs at a constant temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. It does not freeze. It does not stop. She paused. He also documented the prevailing wind patterns in this valley. The westerlies create a specific drift pattern on the lee side of Sentinel Ridge. Every winter, the snow accumulates on that north face to depths of 10 feet or more. Crane blinked. And that's a selling point. Snow 10 feet thick, Eleanor said quietly, has the same insulating value as 6 feet of solid timber. It does not let heat in. It does not let cold out. It is one of the most effective insulators that exists on this earth, and every winter, this valley produces it in quantities that no mill could match. She met his eyes. You have been fighting the cold for 20 years, Mayor. I intend to use it. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before it. Crane sat very still. Behind his eyes, something moved. Something that was almost curiosity, before the doors of habit and certainty swung shut again. "You want to live on the north face of Sentinel Ridge," he said slowly. "In the ground." "I want to build a home dug into the hillside," Eleanor said. "3 walls of earth, 1 wall of stone and timber facing south with a glass window and a proper door. A sod roof, with the earth's natural warmth, a small stove for supplemental heat, and a gravity-fed water line from the spring. I will have running water when every pump and well in this valley is frozen solid. I will be warm when every structure on the valley floor is fighting a losing battle against the cold." She paused once more. "I will survive any winter this territory can produce." Aldous Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth found its way toward a smirk. He saw quite clearly a grieving woman clutching a dead man's mathematics. He saw a widow who had let sorrow curdle into some elaborate, expensive fantasy. He saw very practically an easy $20. "The assessed value on that parcel," he said, reaching for his stamp, "is $20. He pressed the stamp into the ink, then onto the deed, with the small flourish of a man who believed he was doing someone a kindness. "It's yours, Mrs. Voss. Don't come to me when you've dug your own grave and can't climb out." Eleanor picked up the deed. She folded it once precisely and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest. "Thank you, Mayor," she said. And she walked out into the June morning without looking back. She did not tell Crane what she had not told anyone, that the plan was not hers, that the journals were not simply research material, that Thomas Voss, her husband, had stood on the north face of Sentinel Ridge in the autumn of 1885 and had drawn in his precise and careful hand the complete blueprint for the home she was about to build, that he had mapped every timber, every stone course, every inch of pipe routing, from the geothermal spring to the kitchen basin, that he had calculated the snow load on the sod roof down to the pound per square foot, that he had chosen this land not randomly, not experimentally, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood the earth the way other men understood their own hands. Thomas Voss had not lived to build it. He had died in the winter of 1888 in the bedroom of their rented house in town, his lungs finally surrendering after 11 years of breathing cold mountain air and rail tunnel dust. He had died in the small hours of a February night, with Eleanor's hand in his and the journal open on the bedside table, and his last coherent words had been spoken with his eyes still on the hand-drawn blueprint on the wall. "Build it," he had said. "Eleanor, build it," she had promised, and Eleanor Voss had never broken a promise in her life. News of the widow's purchase reached the saloon before Eleanor had finished the walk home. This was the nature of Coldwater Flats. It was a town of perhaps 300 souls set in a long valley between ridgelines accessible by rail and by stubborn determination. It had a proper main street, a new water tower, a source of considerable civic pride, 2 churches, a general store, a doctor's office, a blacksmith, and a saloon that served as the town's unofficial parliament. The parliament convened on the subject of Eleanor Voss with considerable enthusiasm. Calhoun Briggs held court from his usual stool at the far end of the bar. He was the town's primary builder, a large, square, confident man in his early 50s, who had constructed most of the significant buildings in Coldwater Flats, and who held opinions about construction with the fervor of a religious convert. He had been building above ground for 30 years. He had opinions about that too. "She's going to dig into the hillside," he announced to the general amusement of the assembled. "Like a prairie dog, like a badger." He set down his glass. "We spent 1,000 years climbing out of caves, and this woman wants to climb back in." Laughter ran along the bar. Someone repeated the phrase "climbing back in," and it got a second round. "They're calling it the snow grave," said the man beside him. His name was Pershing, and he worked at the assay office, and he had a gift for naming things that stuck. Widow Voss and her snow grave. The name was perfect. It was cruel in the specific way that names in small towns are cruel, not shouted but repeated, passed along quietly until it was everywhere, until it was the only name anyone used. The snow grave. And its inhabitant became quietly, inevitably, the Dirt Widow. Calhoun Briggs started a betting pool. 10-to-1 odds that the roof would collapse before Christmas, 20-to-1 that Eleanor Voss would be found frozen inside by the new year. He wrote the odds on a chalkboard behind the bar. with the date and his initials, and men who had never gambled on anything more consequential than a horse race pressed nickels and quarters into his palm with the comfortable righteousness of people betting on the obvious. Harlan Mercer did not bet. He didn't need to. He simply pointed. Harlan Mercer was the wealthiest man in Coldwater Flats by a margin so wide it had ceased to be interesting. He had made his fortune in cattle, had held it through 2 hard winters and a collapse in beef prices, and had recently expressed that fortune in the form of a 2-story Victorian home on the valley floor that had cost, by his own proud accounting, $3,500. It had been shipped by rail from a firm in Chicago. It had leaded glass windows. It had a wraparound porch with gingerbread trim. It had a parlor with a proper fireplace and wallpaper imported from a catalog. Standing on that porch on a June evening, Harlan Mercer looked up toward the north face of Sentinel Ridge and felt something that he might, if pressed, have called pity. But it wore the clothes of contempt, which was more comfortable. $3,500, he said to no one in particular, or possibly to everyone. That's what it costs to meet this country on proper terms, to build something that stands. He shook his head slowly. Meanwhile, the dirt widow is spending $20 to dig herself a hole. He picked up his whiskey. It's not just foolish. It's an insult to every man who ever built something worth looking at. Dr. Augustine Price was more clinical in his disapproval, which made it somehow worse. He was the town's only physician, a thin, precise man in his mid-40s who had trained in Philadelphia and had never quite forgiven Montana for not being Philadelphia. He had opinions about medicine, about sanitation, about the proper conditions for human habitation, and he expressed them in the measured cadences of a man who had given the subject considerable professional thought. Living in direct contact with the earth, he said one Sunday after services to a circle of nodding parishioners, introduces an individual to a sustained environment of damp, confined air, limited solar exposure and proximity to biological decay within the soil matrix. He paused to let this settle. The human constitution requires light. It requires movement of clean air. To bury oneself underground, particularly through the winter months, is to court lung complaints, melancholia, and a general deterioration of the vital humors. He folded his hands. I speak not from personal opinion, but from the medical literature. Mrs. Voss's plan is, from a clinical standpoint, very nearly suicidal. The townswomen nodded. They had, many of them, genuinely liked Eleanor Voss before all of this had brought her food, after Thomas died, had sat with her through the early weeks of grief. But grief was supposed to look a certain way. It was supposed to be quiet and dignified, and to eventually resolve itself into a kind of careful, modest continuation of normal life. It was not supposed to look like this. It was not supposed to involve dynamite, an iron pipe, and a dead man's geological journals, and the purchase of the most scorned piece of land in the county. They pulled away from her with the careful distance of people who believed that a certain kind of strangeness might be contagious. When Eleanor came into the general store for supplies, conversation shifted. Eyes found other places to be. Invitations to church socials, which had been extended warmly in the months after Thomas died, stopped arriving. Pulling a Voss, they started saying. When old Whitmore tried to divert his irrigation ditch at an unconventional angle, and it collapsed, his neighbor looked at the wreckage and shook his head. Tried to pull a Voss, did you? It meant doing the complicated thing when the simple thing was right there. It meant mistaking stubbornness for wisdom. It meant the particular folly of a grieving woman with too many ideas. Eleanor heard it. She was not deaf, and Coldwater Flats was not large. She bore it all with a composure that had nothing to do with indifference. It had everything to do with the blueprint on the wall of her rented room, the open journal on her table, and the specific weight of a promise made to a dying man. She did not need the town to believe in her. She needed the earth to behave as Thomas had calculated it would. She needed the spring to flow. She needed the snow to come. She needed to get to work. On the first morning of July, Eleanor Voss rode Roan up the north face of Sentinel Ridge with a coil of rope, a block and tackle, 2 sticks of dynamite, and a handwritten list of materials in her coat pocket. She had learned to use dynamite from watching Northern Pacific blasting crews during the years she had traveled with Thomas on survey expeditions. She had paid close attention. Thomas had encouraged it, he believed, with a quiet consistency that a person who understood how things worked was always better positioned than a person who simply watched. Eleanor had paid attention to a great many things during those years. She chose her charges carefully. Small ones, precise. She had no interest in moving more rock than necessary. Each unnecessary ton was a ton she and Roan would have to haul away. The first detonation split the rocky subsoil along a natural seam that Thomas had marked in his notes. The sound rolled down the valley, and the people of Coldwater Flats looked up from their work and looked back down again. Just the widow, they said. Just the dirt widow and her hole. The excavation took 6 weeks of the kind of labor that empties a person completely by evening and fills them back up again slowly through the night. Eleanor dug. Roan hauled. The stone sled she had built from plans in an old trapper's almanac moved ton after ton of fractured rock away from the hillside and into a growing pile that she was already calculating as wall material. The space she was carving was 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, not a cave, not a burrow, but a room. A real room. The kind of room a person could live in with dignity. She worked from Thomas's blueprint with the care of someone copying a sacred text, checking measurements twice, 3 times cutting nothing short. In the 4th week of July, she hired a man named Gideon for $10 to help her fell the main timber. Gideon asked no questions about why she was building, where she was building, or how she intended to survive the winter, or what she thought of the betting pool in town. He came when she said to come, worked until she said to stop, took his $10, and rode away without looking back. Eleanor appreciated him more than she ever told him. The main beams were 12-inch pine logs stripped and treated with creosote against rot. They went in over 2 days of work that left Eleanor's shoulders in a state she did not mention to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. She mortared the fieldstone walls by hand, a skill she had acquired from Thomas's notes and from the simple persistence of doing it wrong until she did it right. The front wall was stone and timber set deep. In it, a single south-facing window of doubled glass panes sealed against air movement. It had cost her $8, the single most expensive item in her budget so far, and she had bargained the glassmaker in the next town down by $2 by agreeing to pick up the panels herself rather than pay for delivery. The door was solid oak, 3 inches thick, hung on iron hinges that she had bartered for with a pound of venison jerky from the blacksmith who didn't ask any questions either. The water system took a full week on its own. She found the spring on the 3rd day of August, exactly where Thomas's journal said it would be, a fissure in the rock face 15 feet above the proposed cabin level, issuing a steady trickle of water. That was when she dipped her hand into it and counted to 10, noticeably warm. 50 degrees exactly as Thomas had written. The kind of warmth that would never freeze, not in any winter Montana could produce. She laid the iron pipe herself, burying each section in a hand-dug trench 3 feet deep, packed tight against the frost line. It took 400 feet of pipe to run from the spring to the basin inside the cabin, and the pipe cost her $50 more than twice what the land had cost. But the pipe was the whole point. Without the pipe, she had a warm room. With the pipe, she had running water in January, in Montana, in a winter that could hit 40 degrees below zero. The difference between those two things was not comfort, it was survival. The roof was the final and most demanding undertaking. Heavy timber crossbeams first, then a layer of oiled canvas stretched and sealed for waterproofing. Then the sod. Eleanor had spent 2 evenings in late July cutting prairie sod into uniform bricks, each one roughly 18 inches by 12, each one weighing 50 pounds when dry and considerably more after rain. She had cut 460 of them. She knew the number precisely because she had counted twice. Moving 460 50-pound bricks up a ramp onto a roof one by one with a block and tackle and a horse and no other help over the course of 12 days. In August, heat was a kind of work that does not have a name in ordinary language. It is the kind of work that burns away everything except the next brick, the next pull, the next step. Eleanor did not think about the town. She did not think about Calhoun Briggs's chalkboard, or Harlan Mercer's porch, or Dr. Price's clinical assessments. She thought about the brick in front of her and the rope in her hands and Roan's patient strength, and she did not stop. The sod went down in overlapping rows like shingles edges pressed tight. It would knit together over weeks. Grass would grow back through it, roots binding root. By winter, it would be a living, breathing layer of insulation, holding the warmth in and the cold out exactly as Thomas had calculated. Adjacent to the main room, she built Roan's stable dug into the same hillside, sharing the main cabin's interior stone wall to benefit from its warmth. A horse, she knew, generates significant body heat. The combined warmth of horse and stove and earth would create a closed system of remarkable thermal stability. Thomas had calculated this too in a footnote she had read so many times the ink was beginning to fade under her eyes. By the last day of August, it was done. She stood outside it and looked at what she had built. From the hillside, if you did not know it was there, you might have missed it entirely. The south-facing stone wall was visible, the window catching the low evening light, the oak door solid in its frame, but everything else was the hill. Grass, rocks, snow that had come early this year on the upper elevations. It looked like nothing. It looked like it had always been there. Her total expenditure, $20 for the land, 10 for Gideon's labor, 8 for the window glass, 30 for materials and creosote for the timbers, 50 for the iron pipe, $27 in change for additional stone mortar, door hardware, and the small cast iron stove she had found at an estate sale and hauled up the ridge on the stone sled. $145, $3,555 less than Harlan Mercer's Victorian on the valley floor. She did not calculate this as a point of pride. She calculated it as a fact the way Thomas had always calculated facts, not as weapons, but as information. Information that told her something about the nature of what she had built and the nature of what she had decided to believe in. Eleanor Voss moved into the hillside home on the 2nd of September, 1889, with Roan, her cast iron stove, Thomas's journals, and a modest supply of potatoes, flour, dried beans, and cured venison. She built a fire in the stove that first evening, more for ceremony than necessity. The interior temperature of the cabin, banked by earth, and the season's accumulated warmth was already 62 degrees Fahrenheit. She turned the brass tap. Water ran freely into the tin basin, warm to the touch. Not hot, not bath water, but undeniably, impossibly beautifully warm. 52 degrees in early September, flowing as if the surrounding rock had no knowledge of autumn at all. Eleanor Voss stood at her kitchen basin on a September evening and let the water run over her hand, and she closed her eyes. "Thomas," she said quietly to the stone walls, to the earth, to the man in the journal, "it works." The late summer heat wave that baked Montana in September and into early October turned the wooden houses of Coldwater Flats into something like bread ovens. Families took their dinners outside on the porch to escape the trapped heat radiating from floor and ceiling. Children slept on lawns. Livestock grew listless. Even Harlan Mercer's Grand Victorian, with its high ceilings and its wraparound porch, became in the afternoons a place that was difficult to occupy with any comfort. The interior of Eleanor's cabin never rose above 65 degrees. The earth walls absorbed excess warmth and stored it, returning it gradually, maintaining a temperature that was independent of the chaos outside. In the mornings when she opened her door and felt the furnace blast of early autumn sun on the already heated hillside, she would turn back into her room, which was cool and quiet and smelled of stone and pine and the faint mineral tang of the spring water, and she would sit with her coffee and Thomas's journal and feel something that a less practical woman might have called contentment. She observed the town from her small window in the evenings when the lights of Coldwater Flats came on one by one in the valley below. From the ridge they looked small and warm and unaware. She felt no bitterness toward them, not exactly. She felt what Thomas had described in his journals as the particular loneliness of knowing something true that no one around you will accept. Not the sharp loneliness of rejection, but the dull, constant weight of it. He had written, "They will call it madness, because it is easier to mock what one does not understand than to question one's own assumptions." The question, Eleanor, is never what they think of us. The question is whether the earth behaves as we understand it to behave. If we are right, the seasons will prove it. If we are wrong, we will know it early enough to correct our error. Either way, certainty belongs to the work, not to the opinion. She had read that passage so many times it no longer felt like words. It felt like a voice. One evening in the third week of September, Calhoun Briggs walked out behind the saloon to relieve himself and happened to look up towards Sentinel Ridge. It was dusk. The valley was cooling toward night, and on the north face of the ridge, just barely visible against the darkening slope, was a thin thread of smoke from Eleanor Voss's iron stove. He stood there longer than he meant to. It was an unremarkable amount of smoke. Any house fire would have produced more. But something about it, its thinness, its steadiness, its complete indifference to the cooling air around it, made Calhoun Briggs go still in a way he had not gone still in some time. He did not tell anyone what he had noticed. He went back inside and ordered another drink and said nothing, and the chalkboard with its betting odds remained in place, and the next morning he went back to his work of building above-ground structures out of timber in confidence. And he did not think about the smoke on the ridge again for several weeks. But he thought about it. What happened next is a thing that small towns will always do, and that Coldwater Flats did with particular efficiency. They talked about the wrong things and they missed the right ones. They talked about Eleanor's eccentricity. They talked about the appropriateness of a widow living alone on a ridge without neighbors or society. They talked about Thomas Voss's journals in the way people talk about the enthusiasms of the dead, with a kind of indulgent, pitying dismissal, as though death had settled the question of whether a man's ideas were sound. They talked about the folly of spending $50 on iron pipe for a home that would probably be uninhabitable by spring. They did not talk about the barometric pressure readings from the weather station in Denver, which had been published in the territorial newspaper in November, and which showed to anyone who understood such things a pattern of atmospheric behavior that Thomas Voss had specifically noted in his journals as a precursor to a particular kind of storm. They did not talk about the deer. But Mayor Aldous Crane's son, Willard Crane, talked about something else entirely, though not to the town and not in any saloon, but in the kitchen of his father's house on a cold November evening, with the fire going and the lamp turned low. Willard was 24, quiet in the way of young men who have learned that their father's certainties leave little room for anyone else's. He had in early October done something that he had not planned to do and had not told anyone about afterward. He had ridden up to Sentinel Ridge after dark and walked along the hillside and looked at Eleanor Voss's home from the outside, at the stone face of it, in the sod roof, and the small window lit from within, and he had stood there for 10 minutes in the cooling dark. He told his father what he had seen. "The construction is sound," he said carefully. "The timbers are properly seated. The stonework it's good work, Pa, better than some of what Briggs puts up in town, and the sod roof is holding." He paused. "The chimney smoke is barely visible even with the stove going. She's not burning much fuel. Whatever she's built in there, it's holding its heat without the fire." Aldous Crane sat very still across the table from his son. He was a man whose professional self-image depended on the correctness of his judgments, and his judgment in this case had been expressed publicly and with considerable finality. He had stamped that deed. He had said on at least 3 separate public occasions that the widow Voss had lost her mind. He had also quietly in the privacy of his own office in late October read a weather report from the Denver station that contained language he did not like at all. He said nothing to Willard about this. He looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. "The structure may be adequate for autumn," he said finally, with the careful precision of a man constructing an escape route. "The real test will be the winter." Willard looked at his father. He did not say what he was thinking because he was 24 and had learned that there was a cost to saying certain things in certain rooms. He thought the real test is already coming, and she's the only one who seems to know it. November dusted the valley in the way that early winter does, tentatively, apologetically, as though trying out the idea before committing. Light snow in the mornings, cold nights, frost on the pump handles by dawn. Eleanor's sod roof held through all of it without comment. She had spent the autumn months in preparations that, to an outside observer, might have seemed modest to the point of being casual. She had put up vegetables from a small kitchen garden she had planted in a south-facing hollow near the spring. She had cured a modest amount of venison. She had laid in a stack of firewood that was, by the standards of any other household, preparing for a Montana winter laughably small. Her neighbors, had she had any, would have assumed she was unprepared. She was not unprepared. She simply had a different model for what preparation meant. She stocked what she needed. Not more, the earth would do the rest. In the long evenings, she read Thomas's journals by the kerosene lamp. She read not the technical sections. Now she had those memorized, had lived them through her hands over the summer, but the personal sections, the asides, the places where Thomas Voss, geological surveyor, husband, careful scientist, let his guard down and simply wrote what he felt. November 14th, 1887. There is something I find difficult to articulate about the way the Earth stores warmth. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply holds. The way a good person holds their integrity under pressure, without fanfare, without needing to be observed. I find this more comforting than I expected to. She read that one twice. She read it a third time. Then she set the journal down and looked at the stone walls of her room, at the faint moisture on the deep winter side where the earth pressed close, at the warmth that rose without a single log in the stove. "You were right," she said to the walls. "You were right about everything." She went to her barometer, a quality instrument, the kind Thomas had carried on surveys, and noted the reading in her own small journal. The pressure had been dropping for 3 days, not dramatically, gradually, with the patience of something enormous beginning to move. She noted the deer she had seen that morning from her window, a large herd moving with the particular urgency that animals reserve for genuine emergency. Not grazing movement, not the leisurely migration of a herd following fodder. This was retreat. This was the wordless, instinctual knowledge of creatures who have no capacity for denial. She went to her door and checked the seal around the frame. She went to her window and tested the secondary interior shutter she had built in October. She went to the stable and checked Roan's water trough and his hay supply, running her hand along his flank as he turned his head to look at her, with the calm, dark patience of an animal who has decided in his own uncomplicated way that wherever this woman goes, that is the right place to be. "We're ready," she told him. She went back inside and sat in the chair by the stove and opened Thomas's journal to the last entry. It was short. He had been very ill by then, and the handwriting showed it, not the precise small script of the survey years, but something larger, less controlled, written in a hand that shook and steadied and shook again. "Eleanor, the earth will hold. Trust the earth. Trust yourself. I am sorry I will not be there to see it. I am not sorry I planned it. Build it exactly as we drew it. Do not change a single thing. The calculations are sound." And then below that, in what must have been his last good hour of that last good day, "They will call you mad. Let them. Madness that keeps you warm is wiser than pride that lets you freeze." Eleanor Voss closed the journal. She set it on the table beside the lamp. She looked at the south-facing window, dark now, the valley below, invisible in the deep November night. She found the barometer and read it once more. The pressure had dropped another 2 points since morning. She had never seen it fall this fast. Not in 11 years of reading Thomas's records. Not once, I know. She sat back down in her chair. The stove made its small, contented sounds. Roan shifted in the stable next door. The stone walls held their warmth around her like cupped hands. Outside, the first real wind of winter moved over the ridge, not howling yet, not the thing it would become, but something lower. Something that moved along the ground and said in the only language weather speaks, "Something is coming. Something is coming that has not come before." Eleanor Voss listened. "Thomas," she said quietly to the lamp, to the journal, to the stone, "I hope you calculated right." The barometer fell through the floor on December 20th. Eleanor had been tracking it twice daily since November morning and evening. The readings entered in her small journal, in her own careful hand, a column of numbers that told a story, the way all true stories are told, gradually, then all at once. For 6 weeks, the pressure had dropped in the measured, ordinary way of a Montana winter settling in. Slow, predictable, the kind of decline that old ranchers read in their joints and called weather coming. What happened on December 20th was different. She checked the instrument at 7 in the morning, noted the reading, and went about her work. When she checked it again at noon, she stopped, checked it a second time, held the lamp closer as though proximity might change what the needle was telling her. It did not. In 5 hours, the pressure had fallen further than it typically fell in a week. She stood at the instrument for a long moment. Then she went to Thomas's journals and found the entry she was looking for. It was dated February 1886, written from a survey camp in the high country above the Missouri Breaks. Barometric descent of this rate and consistency indicates not a standard winter low, but a true Arctic displacement event. The air mass involved is of continental scale. I have seen this pattern recorded in the survey literature for the blizzard of 1875 and the freeze of 1880. In both cases, the descent preceded the event by approximately 48 hours. The resulting conditions were in both historical instances lethal. 48 hours. Eleanor set the journal down. She stood in the center of her room for a moment, very still, in the way of a person whose mind is moving very fast and whose body has learned to get out of the way. Then she began to move. She spent December 20th in final preparations working with the methodical calm of someone following a list that had existed in their head for months. She checked every seal on the window frame, pressing her palm flat against the interior edge and feeling for the faint ghost of cold air that would indicate a gap. She found one in the lower right corner, less than a finger's width. She sealed it with a mixture of pine pitch and tallow that she had prepared in October specifically for this purpose and had hoped she would not need. She brought in the last of the outdoor firewood, a stack that any neighbor would have laughed at had she had any, and arranged it beside the stove in the order she would use it. She did not need much. The earth did the heavy work. The stove was supplemental, a fine adjustment, on top of a system that largely ran itself. She checked the iron pipe where it entered the cabin through the south wall, running her hand along the insulated section, feeling for any change in temperature that might indicate a problem with the burial depth. Everything was as it should be. She went to Roan's stable and spent an hour there, not because there was an hour's worth of necessary work, but because horses know things. She watched him eat. She watched his ears. She watched the way he held his body in the particular language that horses use to communicate what words cannot. He was calm. He was not the calm of an animal that had failed to notice something. He was the calm of an animal that had noticed everything and had decided that where he was standing was the right place to be. She filled his hay rack to the top. She checked his water trough, the spring-fed line that entered the stable through its own buried pipe. A branch off the main supplied Thomas's idea noted in the margins of the blueprint as a detail that would prove its worth in the first hard winter. The trough was full. The water was the color and temperature of shallow summer creek water, 50 degrees, and flowing with the complete indifference of something that has been flowing since before anyone had opinions about it. "You're all right," she told Roan. He did not disagree. On the morning of December 21st, she went to the south-facing window and looked down at Coldwater Flats. The town looked like itself, smoke from chimneys, a few figures on the main street. The water tower standing against the gray sky with the civic pride of a thing that has never yet been tested. Harlan Mercer's Victorian sat on the valley floor, with its leaded windows catching the flat winter light, its gingerbread trim precise against the whitened ground, its wraparound porch as elegant and exposed as a ballroom floor. She thought about going down. She thought about it seriously in the way of a person who has decided against something but wants to be sure the decision is honest. She could ride Roan down the ridge. She could walk into Aldous Crane's office or into the saloon or into the general store where people gathered, and she could put Thomas's journals on the table and open them to the February 1886 entry and say 48 hours. You have 48 hours. She knew exactly what would happen. She had rehearsed it in the long evenings of autumn, not because she wanted to convince herself, but because the knowing of it was important. They would listen with the polite, slightly pained attention people give to someone they have already categorized. They would nod. They would thank her. Calhoun Briggs would say something that got a laugh. Someone would use the phrase, pulling a Voss. Aldous Crane would fold his hands and speak slowly the way he spoke to people he had decided were not entirely rational. They would pat her on the shoulder and send her back to her hole in the ground and return to their suppers. Their disbelief was not a mood, it was a structure. And structures do not come down because you knock on them politely. She turned away from the window. "I will save the only life I can be certain of," she said to the stone walls, to Thomas's journal on the table. And then, because she was Eleanor Voss, and Eleanor Voss did not traffic in self-pity, that will have to be enough. It was not enough. She knew that too. The sky on December 22nd was the wrong color from the moment it got light. Not the gray of ordinary winter overcast, not the white-yellow of snow coming. Something bruised and greenish in the west, the color of old copper or deep ice, the color of a sky that has decided to stop being merely sky and become something more serious. Eleanor noted it at first light and did not look away from it for long. By mid-morning, the birds were gone, not reduced gone. The chatter of chickadees that had accompanied every morning of the autumn, the occasional complaint of a jay, the magpies that Eleanor had privately come to think of as neighbors of a sort, all of it absent. The silence where bird sound had been was not simply quiet, it was subtractive, the way a missing tooth is not simply an absence, but a presence of its own, a thing you feel with your tongue. At 2 in the afternoon, she watched a column of mule deer come off the high country above the ridge at a pace she had never seen deer move at. Not the leisurely descent of animals following feed. Not even the bounding flight of animals startled by a predator. This was something else. This was the movement of animals that have received information from a source older than any of them, passed down through a chain of generations so long it has ceased to be learning and become instinct, and what the information said in the wordless language of 10,000 years of survival was not here. Not here. Go, Eleanor watched them until they disappeared into the river-bottom thickets. Then she turned from the window. She checked the barometer. The needle was in territory she had never seen it occupy. She checked it a second time. She picked up her pen and wrote the number in her journal, and the act of writing it made it real in the way that witnessed things are more real than merely observed ones. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the wind died completely. This was the thing that Thomas had written about. This specific thing. She found the passage without searching for it because she had read it enough times that her hands knew where it lived in the journal. Before the true event begins, there will be a cessation of wind that is total and immediate. Do not mistake this for the storm passing. This is the eye of the approaching system, the inhalation before the scream. In the 1875 event, witnesses reported that this silence lasted between 4 and 12 minutes. Those who went outside to investigate did not all come back. 4:31, 4:32. Eleanor sat in her chair with her hands folded on the table and listened to the silence. It was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It pressed against the stone walls and the sod roof and the south-facing window, like something physical, like something that had weight. Roan next door had gone completely still. The silence lasted 7 minutes. Then the storm hit Coldwater Flats like a wall. She heard it first as a change in air pressure, a physical sensation, a pop in her ears, the same feeling as descending fast from a high elevation. Then the sound arrived, and the sound was not a howl and not a roar, but something between those things and below them, a frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and communicate directly with the chest, the gut, the oldest parts of the brain that remember when wind was not weather but predator. The temperature outside, which had been a manageable 15 degrees Fahrenheit at sundown, dropped to -20 in less than 30 minutes. She tracked it on Thomas's survey thermometer, mounted on the exterior wall, with a small interior-facing window of its own, another footnote detail from the blueprint. At -20, she stopped reading it every 15 minutes and started reading it every 5. By 9 o'clock in the evening, it had reached -38. Inside the cabin, the temperature was 68 degrees. She had added 1 log to the stove at sundown, not from necessity, but from an abundance of caution. The earth walls fully loaded with the summer's accumulated warmth, and now insulated under what she estimated from the sound of it was already 8 to 10 feet of wind-driven snow, were doing what Thomas had calculated they would do. The system was running itself. She heated water in the kettle. She made tea. She brought Roan an extra ration of oats, which he accepted with the dignified appreciation of a horse who has decided that tonight is a good night to be indoors. She sat at her table and tried to read and found that she could not. Not because she was afraid she was not afraid, or not in the way fear usually presents itself. She was afraid in the way that a person is afraid on behalf of others, the particular helpless dread of someone who is safe watching something dangerous approach people who are not. She thought about Calhoun Briggs' daughter, a girl of 7 or 8, she had seen sometimes in the general store, a serious child with her father's square jaw and her mother's eyes. She thought about Dr. Price's patients, whoever they were tonight, whether they were warm. She thought about the families in the wooden houses on the valley floor, those proud above-ground structures that had been built for sunny days and believed in their own adequacy because they had never been tested. Not like this, not with what was coming through the valley right now. The wind was doing 60 miles per hour. She could feel it in the ridge above her. Not hear it, feel it, a vibration transmitted through the earth and into the stone walls and up through the chair legs and into her body. The snow it was driving was not the soft, fat flakes of picture book winter. It was a fine powder of ice crystals moving at the speed of a locomotive, dense enough to fill the lungs, abrasive enough to scour wood, lethal enough to disorient a person past recovery in under 4 minutes. She knew all of this from Thomas's journals. She sat with the knowing of it, and she listened to the storm she could barely hear, and she felt the warmth that surrounded her like a kept promise. She did not sleep easily that night, but she slept. In the town of Coldwater Flats, the first casualties were the windows. Harlan Mercer's Victorian had been his proudest achievement, and its windows had been his most explicit statement of that pride, large panes of single-thickness glass chosen for the view they offered, for the light they let in, for the clear signal they sent about the kind of man who lived behind them. A man who did not need to hide from the weather, a man who had, in some fundamental sense, defeated it. The glass lasted until 8:17 in the evening, when the first pane in the front parlor gave way under a combination of wind pressure, thermal shock, and the impact of a piece of airborne timber from a neighbor's collapsed woodpile. The sound it made going was swallowed immediately by the storm. One moment there was a wall between the Mercer family and the night. The next moment there was not. The cold entered the parlor at 38 degrees below zero, riding 60-mile-an-hour wind, and within 3 minutes the room was uninhabitable. Harlan Mercer pushed his family up the stairs to the second floor, where the windows were smaller and had not yet failed, and they huddled in the master bedroom with every blanket and quilt and piece of clothing they owned piled onto the bed. And the cold came for them anyway, patient and thorough and completely without malice. By midnight, the temperature in the upstairs bedroom was 19 degrees. Mercer's wife, Constance, had stopped shivering, which he knew enough to know was not a good sign. Eli, their 7-year-old nephew who had been staying with them through the holiday week, his parents delayed by weather 2 towns east, burrowed silently between them and said nothing, and then when Mercer tried to check on him, turned a face toward his uncle that was the color of old candle wax. "I'm cold, Uncle Harlan," he said. Mercer held the boy and did not answer because there was no honest answer that helped. The water tower failed at 10:30 on the night of December 22nd. It was the town's newest infrastructure, its most modern feature, the symbol of Coldwater Flats' arrival into a particular kind of civic seriousness. The engineer who had designed it had calculated for a standard Montana winter. He had not calculated for this. The water inside the tower reached the temperature at which expansion becomes irresistible. The iron seams, which had been riveted tight against ordinary pressure, were not made for this pressure. The sound the tower made as it split, a deep, resonant scream of tortured metal, lasted approximately 4 seconds and was audible across the entire valley, even through the storm, a dying sound, the sound of a thing failing at the limit of what it was built to be. Every faucet in Coldwater Flats went dry within the hour. Every pump handle froze solid, not stiff, not difficult, but immovable, iron locked in iron, no more operable than the hinge on a bank vault. The wells, those that had been dug deep enough to find good water, had their upper sections frozen to a depth that no bucket could reach. In wooden homes throughout the valley, people who were already fighting the cold realized in succession that they were also fighting thirst. The human body, working as hard as a body works when it is trying to maintain core temperature in severe cold burns through its water stores with a speed that in ordinary circumstances would be alarming. In these circumstances, it was worse than alarming. There was no water. In the homes that still had fire, those with chimneys that had not yet been overwhelmed by the supercooled air rushing down the flue, killing the flame and replacing it with a torrent of Arctic air that turned rooms into something indistinguishable from outside, people were melting snow in pots and pans. But the snow the storm was driving was not the clean, soft stuff of early winter. It was packed, ice crystal dense, and wind contaminated, and it melted into a gray slurry that no one wanted to drink, and that in a warmer situation they would not have needed to. 3 families on the south end of the valley in homes that had lost their roofs by midnight were in genuine danger of dying where they sat. Dr. Augustin Price spent the first night of the storm treating frostbite by lamplight in his office, the walls of which were sound, but whose single-pane windows were covered in 4 inches of interior frost. He used his own body heat to warm the fingers of a child whose family had made it to his door before the second wave of the storm fully closed the streets. He boiled snow for water, and the snow smelled wrong, and he boiled it anyway and thought about clean water in the way that people only think about things they cannot have. Calhoun Briggs spent the first night of the storm in his own kitchen, the sturdiest room in his house, with his family arranged around him. His wife, his daughter, the serious girl with the square jaw, his son of 15 who was trying not to be afraid and not entirely succeeding. The roof was holding. Briggs had built it, himself had built it, right? And it would hold through the first night, though. The sound it made under the weight of the accumulating snow was a sound he had never heard a roof make before, and that he filed carefully in the part of his mind reserved for things that demand immediate attention. His daughter, whose name was Clara, was coughing. Not sick, the cold and dry air, the kind that pulls moisture from the lungs with each breath. She needed warm water. She needed steam. She needed the simple, ordinary remedy of a warm drink in a warm room, and Calhoun Briggs, master builder of Coldwater Flats, builder of 20 years man, who had placed his name on the betting pool that mocked Eleanor Voss, Calhoun Briggs could not give his daughter a cup of warm water. He sat with this fact through the long hours of the first night and felt it change something in him in the region where a person's assumptions about themselves live. The second night arrived without the storm diminishing by a single degree. Eleanor was on her third log. She was rationing not from necessity, but from precision. She had enough wood for 2 more weeks if she maintained her current rate, and she had no intention of departing from the plan. The temperature inside held at 67 degrees. The tap ran freely. She had eaten a good supper of salt pork and potato, and had given Roan his evening feed and had read by the lamp until her eyes wanted to close. She was reaching to turn down the lamp when she found it. It was not where she had last seen it. She had been using Thomas's journals continuously since the storm began, cross-referencing his calculations, checking his predicted temperature drops against the actuals she was recording, and at some point in the turning of pages and the setting down and picking up the small folded paper had worked free from the back end paper of the third journal, where it had been folded flat and tight and invisible, pressed into the gutter of the binding. She almost missed it. Her hand was moving to close the journal when something about the texture of the page stopped her. She looked closely, peeled back the end paper at the corner. The paper was there, small, folded 4 times. Her name on the outside in Thomas's handwriting, but different from the survey handwriting, not the small, precise survey script, but the larger shaking hand of the last months. She unfolded it slowly, the way you unfold something you are not sure you are ready to read. It was a single paragraph. He had written it from the date he had noted at the top, 11 days before he died. Eleanor Baum, I removed 1 page from the third journal. Page 47. I removed it because I did not want you to worry during the construction. But I am writing this so that you will find it when you need it, because you will need it. The spring may reduce its flow rate during a sustained ground freeze event of severe magnitude. The pressure differential between frozen upper strata and the active aquifer below can temporarily compress the flow to as little as 10% of normal output. This will resolve within 12 to 18 hours as the aquifer pressure equalizes. Do not be afraid when it happens. The water will return, the pipe is sound, the spring is sound. Trust the system, trust yourself. All my love, Thomas. Eleanor read it 3 times. She sat with it for a long moment in the warmth of her stone room, with the storm making its distant, muffled violence against the hill above her, and she felt something move through her that was grief and relief in equal measure. Wound together so tightly she could not have said where one ended and the other began. He had known, and he had protected her from the worry of it during the building when she needed all her energy for the work, and he had hidden the answer where she would find it exactly when she needed it. Not before, not after. She put the paper down very gently. Then the water slowed. She heard it before she saw it, the change in the sound of the tap, the slight drop in pitch that indicated reduced pressure. She crossed to the basin and turned the tap fully open. The flow that came out was a thin thread of what it had been. As she watched, it reduced further to a slow, steady drip. The temperature outside, according to the exterior thermometer, was -41. Eleanor Voss stood at her kitchen basin and read the dripping tap and read Thomas's letter and made a decision so quickly it barely felt like a decision at all. It felt like following a step that had already been placed. She pulled on every layer she owned. She knew before she went out that going out might kill her. She was not confused about this. The storm outside her door was not a thing that made exceptions for good intentions or sound engineering knowledge, or the specific bravery of a woman keeping a promise to a dead man. It was a physical event of sufficient magnitude to kill any unprotected human being in a matter of minutes, and Eleanor Voss was not immune to physics. But she had the buried pipeline's route memorized from the construction. She had paced it enough times to have it in her body. And she had, in a decision she had made in October that she had thought at the time was perhaps overcautious, driven a series of iron marker stakes into the ground along the pipeline route at 12-foot intervals, their tops painted red and extending 18 inches above the grade, high enough she had calculated to be visible above a normal snow accumulation. She tied a rope to the iron ring bolted beside the door, also installed in October, in the same session of cautious preparation, and tied the other end around her waist and went out. The storm was a living thing. It hit her with a physical force that was not like wind, in the normal sense of the word, not a flow but a concussion, a solid moving presence that shoved and pressed and filled every space between the layers of her clothing before she had taken 3 steps. The cold was not temperature. It was a substance. It got into her lungs and sat there like metal. It found her wrists at the gap between glove and sleeve, and it pressed its fingers there and held on. She moved along the rope line step by careful step, feeling for the marker stakes with her feet through the snow, because the visibility was nothing at all, not reduced, not poor nothing. There was no world beyond the reach of her arms. There was only the rope behind her and the ground under her feet and the muffled, furious white. She found the 4th stake. She dug down at that point with the short-handled tool she had tied to her belt, and at 2 feet of depth, she found what she was looking for, a section of iron pipe with a large flat stone resting against it, not deliberately placed, moved there by the frost heave and pressure that Thomas had described in the missing page. The stone was not heavy in ordinary terms. In these terms, with hands she could barely feel in a wind that was trying to take her off the hillside, it was a significant problem. Roan was there. She had not brought him. He had followed her out through the stable's exterior door, the one that connected to the hillside rather than the main cabin. She had not heard him over the storm, had not seen him in the whiteout. But when she looked up from the pipe, he was standing directly behind her, blocking the worst of the wind, with his body, his head lowered, positioned as deliberately as a wall. She did not stop to feel anything about this. She used his windbreak. She used her hands. The stone moved. The pipe underneath was intact, undamaged, just constricted by the pressure from above. She cleared the surrounding soil as best she could, repacked it firmly, and pulled herself upright, using the rope and Rowan's shoulder in equal measure. They got back inside. Eleanor stood in the middle of her room with ice in her eyebrows and feeling returning to her hands in the specific agony that returning feeling always announces, and she watched the tap. The drip slowed further, stopped. She counted. At 43 seconds, the tap produced a trickle. At 90 seconds, the trickle strengthened. At 4 minutes, the flow was back to normal, not quite full pressure, but close enough the sound of it filling the basin, as ordinary and miraculous as rain on a dry summer afternoon. Eleanor Voss sat down on the floor of her kitchen. She sat with her back against the stone wall and her hands palm up in her lap, and she cried not in fear, not in relief, though it was both of those things, but in the specific grief of a person who has just understood in their body, rather than their mind, what they have lost and how completely they were loved. "You put it where I'd find it," she said. "You put the answer where I'd find it when I needed it." She stayed on the floor for a while. Roan was in his stable. The water ran. The stove breathed its small, steady warmth. The storm pressed against the hill above her with all the force of a continental weather system doing the job it had been designed by physics to do, insulating, pressing, covering, burying the cabin deeper under its white weight with every hour. She got up off the floor. She washed her face. She put another log on the stove. She sat back down at the table. And then something hit her door. Not a knock. A strike, something without precision, fist, forearm, possibly a head. The sound of a person who has passed beyond the knocking stage and arrived at the stage of just making contact with something solid before they stop being able to. Eleanor was at the door in 3 steps. She undid the bar and pulled it open, and the cold came in like a boarder who hasn't been invited but intends to stay, and with it came a shape that resolved itself as her eyes adjusted into a man carrying something small. Calhoun Briggs. His face was a mask of frozen blood from somewhere on his forehead that had been bleeding, and then the blood had stopped moving in the cold air and fixed itself there. His beard was iron with ice. His hands holding the bundle against his chest were the wrong color, the yellowish white that is past pain and approaching something permanent. The bundle was his daughter, Clara, the serious girl. She was wrapped in what had been a blanket before the cold made it into a board. Help us, Briggs said. His voice was the voice of a machine running on the last of its fuel functional, barely at the edge of its capacity. For the love of God, the roof, we have no water. Clara is... Eleanor did not let him finish. She stepped back. She held the door wide. She reached for the child with both arms. Get inside, she said. Bring her to the fire. Briggs stumbled across the threshold and stopped. He stood in the center of Eleanor Voss's kitchen, and he could not move. Not from injury, though he was injured. Not from cold, though he was deeply cold. He stopped because of the warmth, the specific, impossible, 68-degree warmth that surrounded him like a correction, like the world reasserting a fact he had forgotten was possible. He looked at the stove. He looked at the tap running its thin, steady stream into the basin. He looked at the walls and the ceiling, and the lamp on the table, and the open journal, and the cup of tea that was still warm, because this room was 68 degrees, and this room was always 68 degrees, and had been 68 degrees while his daughter turned the color of old wax in the house he had built himself, the above-ground house, the proper house, the kind of house a real builder builds. Eleanor had Clara by the fire. She was unwrapping the blanket with the practiced efficiency of someone who has decided not to feel what she is feeling until the work is done. She wrapped the child in dry wool from the chest by the stove. She poured warm water, tap water, 52 degrees, the water that was always there, into a cup and held it to Clara's lips. The girl drank. Her hands, Eleanor said to Briggs, come here and hold her hands between yours. Your core temperature is still good enough. Give her what you have. Briggs crossed the room and knelt by the fire and took his daughter's hands in his, and he held them, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were doing something that had nothing to do with the cold. I put your name on a chalkboard, he said. I took money from men who bet you'd be dead by Christmas. His voice was stripped of everything: the builder's authority, the saloon confidence, the easy amusement of a man who is certain of his certainties. There was nothing left of all that. I built every house in this town except the one that's standing. Eleanor put her hand briefly on his shoulder. Then she took it away because there were things to do and the night was not over. She's warming, Eleanor said. Keep holding her hands. The next arrival came 40 minutes later. Dr. Augustin Price was 6 people behind him, 2 families, a single woman of 60, whose house had lost its roof, an elderly man, whose fireplace had sent smoke rather than warmth into his room for the past 3 hours. Price stood in the doorway and looked at Eleanor Voss, and his expression was the expression of a man who has assembled and then disassembled his own certainty and is standing in the wreckage of it. He opened his mouth. Eleanor shook her head. There will be time for that, she said. Get your people inside. The old man was dehydrated. She could see it in his skin, his eyes, the way his lips had pulled back from his teeth. She put warm water in him first, carefully, small amounts, the way you rehydrate something that has been dry too long. She did not tell him what she was doing. She simply did it. The room was filling. Eleanor moved through it with the calm efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this without knowing she was rehearsing it, who has spent 6 months in solitary preparation, and in that solitude has prepared, among other things, for this. She assessed. She directed. She portioned. And then Willard Crane was at the door, alone. She looked past him into the dark. Your father, Willard's face told her before his words did. He's at the office. He got to the basement in time. He paused. He's alone. He'll be all right. He said. Willard stopped, looked at the floor. He said to tell you he's sorry. He wanted me to tell you that specifically. Eleanor held the door open. Come in, Willard. Mrs. Voss, there's something else. He came inside and she closed the door behind him, and he dropped his voice through the room was loud enough with 20-odd people that he needn't have. My father received a weather report from Denver. December 1st, it predicted conditions like this. He told me to keep quiet about it. Willard looked at her directly with the eyes of a young man who has recently learned something important about the relationship between silence and consequences. He was afraid that if he corroborated your warnings, people would think he'd been wrong about you. He was more afraid of that than of the storm. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Go get warm, she said quietly. Get near the stove. She turned away and moved back through the room, checking on Clara Briggs, on the old man, on a young mother who was nursing an infant in the warmest corner, and she did not stop moving because the work was what mattered, and the work was what she had. The last one came at near midnight. She heard the sound before the knock, a sound that was not quite knocking and not quite collapsing, the sound of a large man at the end of a large journey sitting down against a door. Eleanor opened it before he had the chance to make another sound. Harlan Mercer was on his knees in the snow, not fallen kneeling. His wife Constance was behind him, her right hand wrapped in cloth that had frozen solid around it. And between them, his face turned upward toward Eleanor's lamplit doorway, was Eli. 7 years old, the color of life coming back into a face that had been losing it. Mercer looked up at Eleanor Voss from his knees in the snow and did not speak. The great man of the valley, the man who had boomed $3,500 at anyone who would listen. He looked up at her from the posture that strips everything away, and his eyes said everything that his mouth had spent 6 months saying the wrong things. Eleanor Voss looked down at him. She looked at Constance. She looked at Eli. "There is room," she said. "All of you, come inside." She stepped back and held the door wide, and the last of the cold came in with them, and she closed it behind them. 27 people in 600 square feet of warm stone, and outside the storm, moved on the ridge like a thing that has decided the argument is over. Inside, the water ran, the stove breathed, the earth held, exactly as Thomas had calculated it would. The storm ended the way it had begun without apology. On the morning of December 26th, the wind simply stopped. Not gradually, not with the slow unwinding of ordinary weather, but completely, as though something enormous had been switched off in the machinery of the sky. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of an ordinary winter morning. It was the silence of aftermath, the silence of a battlefield after the last gun, the silence of a world that has been rearranged in the night and has not yet decided what it intends to be now. Eleanor knew it was over before she checked the barometer. She felt it in the walls, or rather she stopped feeling something in the walls, a vibration so constant across 4 days that she had ceased to notice it as a separate thing, the way you cease to hear a clock ticking until it stops. When the vibration stopped, she woke from a half-sleep in her chair with the lamp burned low and the stove down to coals and 26 other human beings breathing quietly around her in the dark. 27 counting herself. She had counted them before she slept. She added 2 logs to the stove. She turned up the lamp. She went to the barometer and read it and wrote the number down. Then she went to the door. The snow had drifted against it in the night she had expected. This had built the door to open inward, precisely because she had expected this. And when she lifted the bar and pulled it open, she faced a wall of packed white that reached her chin. The cold that came through the gap was still brutal, still deep, the residual cold of a system that had spent 4 days emptying the Arctic into Montana, but it was the cold of a thing that had finished rather than a thing in progress. It was weather again, not event. She went back for the short-handled shovel. It took her 40 minutes to tunnel through 6 feet of wind-packed snow to reach the open air of the hillside. The people behind her, those who were awake, watched in the particular silence of people who have been stripped of everything except gratitude and are not sure yet what to do with that either. When Eleanor finally pushed through the last of the drift and straightened up into the open air of December 26th, she stood very still for a long moment. The world was white in every direction, not the white of a normal snow cover, the kind that softens edges and makes the landscape gentle. This was the white of total reconfiguration, of a country redrawn. The drifts had reshaped the valley floor into something that bore only approximate relation to what had been there before the storm. Where there had been a main street, there was an unbroken plain of white. Where there had been the roof lines of buildings visible against the ridge, some of those lines were still there and some were not, and the ones that were not told their own story without any words. The water tower was gone. Not collapsed, gone in the sense that what remained of it was no longer recognizable as the thing it had been. It was a tangle of iron lying on its side in a berm of ice, half buried, the civic pride of Coldwater Flats reduced to salvage. Harlan Mercer's Victorian sat on the valley floor with the particular dignity of a ruined thing, the dignity of something that was once grand and is now only evidence. The gingerbread trim was coated in a solid carapace of ice 3 inches thick. 2 of the 4 second-story windows were gone open to the sky. The wraparound porch had shed its roof entirely, the boards driven sideways into the surrounding snowfield, where they protruded at angles like the spines of something buried. The front door hung open. Through it at this distance, Eleanor could see only darkness and the faint glitter of interior frost. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She did not feel satisfaction. She had known somewhere in the architecture of herself that she would not, that when this moment came, it would not feel the way vindication is supposed to feel in stories. She had known this since the night of December 22nd, when she had first heard the town failing through the muffled insulation of her walls, and had felt the specific helpless grief of a person who was right about something and could not make it matter fast enough to help. 16 people had not come to her door. She had not counted them yet. She would count them later when the men who went into the town could make the full accounting. But she knew the number would not be small, and she had lived with the knowledge of that number's coming since the second night of the storm when the procession to her door had slowed and then stopped, and she had understood that those who could come had come. The 16 who had not, she would carry them, not as guilt, as weight. There is a difference, and Eleanor Voss understood it, and the understanding did not make the weight lighter, only more precisely calibrated. She turned back to the tunnel in the snow and called down into it. "It's over," she said. "Come out when you're ready. Take your time." They emerged one by one into the blinding white, blinking and slow-moving, each one stopping at the top of the tunnel to look at the valley below, with the expression of people seeing a landscape they thought they knew, and finding it replaced by a stranger. Calhoun Briggs came out with Clara on his back, the girl's arms around his neck, her face pressed against his collar. She was well. Her hands were well. She had slept most of the past 2 days in the warmest corner of Eleanor's cabin and had eaten thin potato soup and warm water and had recovered the color that cold had stolen from her face. Briggs set her down in the snow and stood beside her and looked at the valley for a long time without speaking. Dr. Price came out with the old man whose name was Fennick. 71 years old and a widower who had lived alone in a 2-room wooden house on the east side of town for 12 years, steadying him by the elbow with the careful professional grip of a physician who has temporarily suspended his theories in favor of his instincts. The old man looked at the ruined skyline and made a sound that was not quite a word. Willard Crane came out and looked immediately toward the land office building in the center of town. He found the roofline still there, the one solid commercial building in Coldwater Flats built with double-thick walls and a low-pitched roof that had been engineered for load rather than appearance. His father was in the basement of that building, alive as far as anyone knew. Willard did not say anything about this. He tucked the information away and began helping the next person out of the tunnel. Harlan Mercer came out last with Constance beside him and Eli between them, holding both their hands. Constance's right hand was properly wrapped. Now Dr. Price had treated it through the night with the warm water that Eleanor's tap produced without interruption, and the frostbite was real and serious, but the hand would recover. She would keep her fingers. This was not a small thing. Mercer stood at the top of the tunnel and looked down at his house. He stood there for a long time, long enough that people stopped looking at him and looked away, giving him the privacy that grief of this particular kind, the grief of a man confronting the precise cost of his own pride deserves. Then he turned and he found Eleanor where she stood a few feet away, and he looked at her with eyes that had none of the things in them that his eyes had always had before. No authority, no performance, no comfortable distance of the kind that wealthy men in small towns construct around themselves like a second house. He didn't speak. Not yet. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked away, and there was in that looking away something more honest than anything he had said in the 6 months preceding it. Eleanor turned toward the valley. They all turned toward the valley, the 27 of them on the hillside in the brilliant deadly cold of December 26th, and they began the process of going back down. Mayor Aldous Crane was found exactly where Willard had expected him to be. The door to the land office basement required digging out, and it was Willard who did the digging alone while the others made their way along the main street, assessing what could and could not be entered safely. When the door opened, Crane came out into the light slowly, the way a man comes out of a space he has been in too long, blinking slightly uncertain of his own body, carrying the particular shame of a man who has had 4 days alone with himself and his own decisions and nowhere to put either. He was unhurt. He had found in the land office basement a small iron stove used for record storage, a supply of coal and 2 water barrels that had been placed there as fire protection and had not frozen because they were below the frost line. He had been warm. He had had water. He had been in his own modest way underground and insulated, preserved by the same principle he had mocked Eleanor Voss for proposing. He did not immediately recognize the irony, or perhaps he recognized it completely, and that was why he could not meet anyone's eyes. The accounting of the town took the better part of the day. 37 structures in Coldwater Flats. 19 had sustained damage significant enough to render them uninhabitable without repair. 9 had lost their roofs partially or entirely. 4 had collapsed in whole or in part. Harlan Mercer's Victorian was totaled the term the men used with the flat precision of people who have moved past shock and into practicality, its structural integrity compromised by the combination of window failure, ice infiltration, and the expansion damage that occurs when water finds its way into the joints of a structure and freezes there, working the wood apart from inside. The final accounting of the dead was 16. Eleanor did not hear the number read aloud. She was at her cabin when the count was completed, bringing down additional supplies for the families who were sheltering in the general store, the one building that had maintained its structural integrity and whose owner, a quiet man named Garfield, had opened without being asked and without presenting a bill. But she heard the number later from Willard Crane, and she sat with it in the way she had sat with things through the winter, not fighting it, not burying it, but taking it in fully and finding the place in herself where it would live from now on. 16 people. She knew some of their names. A farmer on the East Valley Road who had lived alone and had not been found until the second day after the storm. A family of 3 in a house whose chimney had failed on the first night, filling the rooms with carbon monoxide before the cold could find them. A young man who had gone out in the first hour of the storm to check on his horses and had been found 200 yards from his own door. Others. She did not allow herself to count the ways they might have been saved. This was the mathematics of a particular kind of suffering that goes on forever and resolves nothing. She counted them once as people by name, where she knew the names, and then she set the counting aside because the living needed things and she had things to give. 1 week after the storm ended, in the first days of January, 1890, the surviving population of Coldwater Flats gathered in the general store. It was cold inside the windows, boarded where the glass had failed, a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room doing what it could against the January air that came through every gap in the boards. People stood in coats and kept their hats on. Children sat on the counter because the floor was cold. It was not a comfortable gathering, but it was an honest one. Mayor Aldous Crane stood on the produce crate that served as the town's impromptu platform and looked at the people in front of him and appeared to be assembling something, not words exactly, but the will to produce words, which is sometimes harder. He opened his mouth, he closed it, he stood there for a moment longer, and then he stepped down from the crate without speaking and sat in a chair at the edge of the room and looked at his hands. This was not cowardice. Eleanor, watching from the back wall, understood it as something more specific than cowardice. It was the collapse of a man who has realized that his authority was always provisional, that it rested on the consent of all people who had trusted his judgment, and that he had spent that trust in the worst possible way on the worst possible occasion. And what was left was not nothing, but it was not what he had had before, and it would take more than a crate and a cleared throat to begin rebuilding it. Harlan Mercer walked to the front of the room. He was not the man who had stood on his Victorian porch 6 months ago pointing at the ridge. That man had lived in a world that confirmed his assumptions at every turn, and that world had ended on December 22nd. The man who stood in front of the general store in January was something the first man had not been reduced. Not broken reduced in the way that reduction is sometimes the beginning of accuracy, the stripping away of everything that was never load-bearing anyway. He stood with his hat in his hands, and he looked across the room at Eleanor Voss, who was standing at the back wall with her arms at her sides and her face composed, and he spoke directly to her the way you speak when you have decided that the least you owe someone is honesty without cushioning. "I called your home a folly," he said. His voice carried without effort in the quiet room. "I called it a grave. I stood on my porch and I pointed at your ridge, and I said that my house, my money was what it looked like to meet this country on proper terms." He paused. He did not look away from her. "I was wrong. I was wrong in the specific, costly way that a man is wrong when he has confused comfort with intelligence and called the confusion wisdom." The room was very quiet. Outside the boarded windows, the January wind moved over the valley floor. You built for the world as it is, Mercer continued. We built for the world we wanted. We fought nature, and nature ended the argument. You respected it, and it sheltered you, and then you sheltered us. He turned the hat in his hands once. 16 people died. 16 people who might have lived if this town had listened to you 6 months ago instead of writing your name on a chalkboard. His voice did not break. It did the harder thing, which was to remain level while carrying that weight. I am asking you in front of everyone here to teach us what you know, to help us rebuild this town the right way, because we have nothing left but the wisdom you tried to share, and we were too proud to take it when it was offered freely. He stopped. He stood with his hat in his hands and waited. Calhoun Briggs stepped forward from the left side of the room. He did not look like a man who held court at the saloon. He looked like a man who has been taught something fundamental and is still in the process of understanding how much it changes. Ma'am, he said to Eleanor, I am a builder who knows nothing. I asked to be your first student. Dr. Augustine Price moved forward from the right. He stood with the precise posture of a man trained in a city that was very far away and that had not prepared him for this moment, and he spoke with the careful enunciation of someone choosing every word. Mrs. Voss, he said, I told this town that your home was unhygienic, that it would cause lung disease and melancholia. I treated your patients. He stopped, corrected himself. I treated our neighbors with water from your tap while their bodies recovered from the effects of the cold. The water was clean. The air in your home was clean. My clinical assessment was entirely wrong. He paused. I would like to understand why it was wrong and what I should have understood instead. If you will teach me, I will learn. Eleanor looked at them, at Mercer with his hat in his hands, at Briggs with his builder's hands open and empty, at Price with his Philadelphia certainty dismantled and set aside, at Willard Crane, who stood beside his father and nodded once when Eleanor's eyes found him, the nod of a young man who has been carrying a difficult truth and is glad to be relieved of it, at the families who had spent 4 days in her 600 square feet and who looked at her now with the uncomplicated gratitude of people who are alive because of a choice someone else made a long time ago. She let the silence run for a moment, not for effect, because what she was about to say was true, and true things deserve the space to land without obstruction. We never wanted to be proven right this way, she said. Her voice was quiet enough that people leaned forward slightly to catch it. Not one of us, not me, not Thomas, not anyone who ever tried to tell this town something it didn't want to hear, wanted the proof to cost what this proof cost. She looked at the room steadily. 16 people paid for what we all shared the pride of it, the stubbornness of it, the conviction that the way things have always been done is the same as the way things ought to be done. She paused. Including mine. I should have tried harder to reach you. I told myself you wouldn't listen, and I used that as a reason not to try. That was its own form of pride. The room absorbed this. It was not what they had expected. They had expected absolution or accusation or something in between. What she gave them was something harder and more useful to share. Of course I will teach you, Eleanor said. We will rebuild together, and we will build it right. The spring of 1890 came late and cold as springs in Montana sometimes do, a slow, grudging retreat of the frost, the ground releasing its ice by degrees, as though uncertain whether to trust the warmth again. Harlan Mercer funded the rebuilding without condition or negotiation. This was not Eleanor understood the generosity of a good man. It was the obligation of a man who has found in a waterproof box in the ruins of his own home a document that he cannot unknow. The Denver Weather Report, the one dated December 1st. The one with his own notations in the margin, figures related to winter beef prices. The calculation of what a publicly predicted severe storm would do to cattle values and market timing. He had showed it to Eleanor himself, alone in the first week of January, on a morning when the general store was empty and the cold was still serious enough to keep most people indoors. He had placed it on the table between them and said nothing and waited. Eleanor had read his margin notes, had sat with the document and with the weight of what it represented, 16 names written in the language of arithmetic and market timing, for longer than was comfortable for either of them. Then she had folded it and slid it back across the table. I'm not going to tell anyone, she said. Mercer looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something between relief and something worse than relief. 16 people, he said. Yes. I could have. Yes. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. The dead are past the reach of what you tell or don't tell, Eleanor said finally. The living need you to rebuild their homes. Do that. Do it right. Do it without counting the cost to yourself. She looked at him steadily. That's all there is left to do. It was the most merciful thing Eleanor Voss ever did. It was also the hardest. She carried the knowledge of that document for the rest of her life, and she never spoke of it to another person, and on certain winter evenings, she would sit with Thomas's journal and read his entry about the costs of silence and feel the full weight of what she had chosen and whether she had chosen correctly. She never fully resolved the question. She carried it instead the way you carry something true that has no clean answer. Calhoun Briggs was her most devoted student. He came to the Ridge every morning through February and March with his sketchbook and his questions. And the questions were the questions of a man who has understood that his previous knowledge was not wrong so much as incomplete. A man who has been looking at a large subject through a small window and has just had the window removed. He drew Eleanor's design from every angle. He sketched the timber joints, the stone courses, the sod roof profile, the pipe routing. He asked about the spring, and she explained it. He asked about the thermal mass calculations, and she gave him Thomas's journal, and he read it with the absorption of a convert discovering a text that explains what he already believed but could not articulate. He calculated all of this in 1885, Briggs said one morning looking up from the journal. He was a careful man, Eleanor said. This is, Briggs stopped, turned a page. This is better engineering than anything I was taught. And I wasn't taught badly. He looked at her. Where did he learn this? From the earth, Eleanor said. From watching what survived and what didn't in 11 years of surveying country that has no patience for bad calculations. She poured him coffee from the pot on the stove. He used to say that the land teaches everything you need to know if you're willing to listen instead of argue. Briggs drank his coffee and was quiet for a moment. I argued, he said. You did, Eleanor agreed. So did I once with different things. The point isn't to have never argued. The point is to stop when the evidence arrives. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. The evidence arrived pretty hard. It usually does, she said, when we've made it wait long enough. The first new homes went up in the spring of 1890, 10 of them, each one carved into the hillsides surrounding the valley, with the care of people who have learned a thing through its absence. No two were identical. Each one adapted Eleanor's principles to its specific location. The angle of the slope, the depth of the bedrock, the nearest water source, the prevailing wind direction of its particular site. This was the part that Briggs grasped most quickly, that the principles were fixed, but the application was local. You had to read the specific ground under your specific feet. Pulling a Voss, he announced one morning at the site of the fourth house to the crew working around him. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a man reclaiming something. The men looked at him. That's what we're doing, he said. We're pulling a Voss, all of us, and it means we're doing it right. He looked around at the hillside, at the excavation taking shape, at the pipe trench being dug with the precision of people who understand what it's for. I want that to be the name for this. When you do the hard thing correctly, instead of the easy thing badly, that's pulling a Voss. I want every builder in this territory to know what that means. It spread the way true things spread in small communities, not by proclamation, but by use, by the organic adoption of an idea that fits the shape of what people have experienced. By the end of that first summer, you could hear it in the valley, and in the next valley, and in the towns connected to Coldwater Flats by the roads that the spring thaw had opened again. Pulling a Voss, a phrase with a history behind it, heavy enough to give it weight, and a meaning precise enough to make it useful. Mayor Aldous Crane rebuilt the town's water system that spring. He did it underground, the pipes buried below the maximum frost depth, the source protected the distribution, designed with the input of a woman he had once sold $20 worth of useless land to, with a smirk and a flourish. He did not make a ceremony of this, did not stand on a crate and deliver remarks. He simply did it quietly with Willard at his side and Eleanor's pipe routing diagrams spread on the table of his repaired land office. He never publicly discussed the Denver weather report. He carried that differently than Eleanor carried it, less cleanly, with more damage in the way of a man who cannot separate the knowledge of what he should have done from the daily act of continuing to exist. He served out the rest of his term and did not seek re-election. He lived quietly in Coldwater Flats for the rest of his life in a modest home that was not a Victorian and was not on the valley floor. Willard Crane, his son, went on to read law and eventually served in the territorial legislature, where he was known in a career of modest but consistent usefulness for a particular attention to public safety infrastructure that his colleagues found almost obsessive and that he never fully explained. Eli Mercer grew up on Sentinel Ridge. This was not figuratively true. After the storm with the Victorian uninhabitable and the valley floor in the process of being reconfigured, Harlan Mercer made the practical decision to move his family into one of the new earth-sheltered homes being built that spring. It was Calhoun Briggs who built it, and it was Eleanor who designed it, and it was Eli who at 7 years old watched every phase of the construction with a focus that made the grown men around him slightly uneasy in the way that children's intense interest in serious things sometimes does. He asked questions no 7-year-old had any business asking, about thermal mass, about the weight of sod per square foot, about why the pipe had to be buried exactly 3 feet and not 2.5. Eleanor answered each question fully as she would have answered an adult because she had found that the questions of children who are genuinely interested are structurally identical to the questions of adults who are genuinely interested and deserve the same quality of answer. By 12, Eli was helping Briggs on construction sites. By 16, he was reading Thomas's journals, the full set which Eleanor lent him, with the solemnity of someone lending a sacred object to someone they trust will treat it accordingly. By the time Eli Mercer was 30, he had applied the Voss method as it was formalized in the building literature of the Montana Territory, by then to construction projects from the high plains of Wyoming to the eastern slopes of the Cascades. He adapted it, refined it, developed variations for different soil types and water table depths in snow load calculations. He wrote a monograph published in 1912 that Thomas Voss would have recognized as a direct continuation of his own work, and that Eleanor, who read it at the age of 61, sat with for an entire evening without putting down. She sent him a letter the following week. Thomas would have been proud, she wrote. I am proud. You asked better questions at 7 than most men ask at 50. That is worth more than any credential. He kept the letter for the rest of his life. Eleanor Voss lived in the hillside home on Sentinel Ridge for 40 years. She did not leave it for anything smaller or easier, which was not obstinacy but practicality. The house worked, and Eleanor had no patience for replacing what worked. She maintained it with the same attention she had brought to its construction, the annual checks of the pipe joints, the replacement of sod bricks as they wore the care of the window seals against the insidious patience of cold air looking for a gap. She was not alone. This was the thing that surprised people who had heard the story from a distance, who imagined the Dirt Widow as a solitary figure on a ridge, persisting in proud isolation for 4 decades. She was not isolated. She was perhaps the least isolated person in Coldwater Flats, which had grown by the time of her later years into a town of some 600 souls, most of whom had reason to think of Eleanor Voss as something between a neighbor and a phenomenon. People came to her for advice about construction, about water sourcing, about the proper depth of a pipe in a hard frost zone and the correct ratio of pine pitch to tallow for sealing a stone wall joint. She gave the advice freely in the direct, unhurried way she had given everything not as a favor but as information, because information was what she had, and sharing it cost her nothing and helped everything. They came for other things too. For the quality of her presence, which was the presence of a person who has been tested against something real and has come out of it knowing with precision what they are made of. Young women in difficult circumstances found their way to her ridge. She did not tell them what to do. She told them what she had done and why, and let them draw what conclusions the facts supported. She did not speak often of Thomas. When she did, it was without grief, not because the grief had gone, but because it had been absorbed, incorporated into the structure of who she was, the way a healed bone is part of the body, and not merely a wound that closed. She spoke of him practically the way she spoke of the spring or the odd roof as a thing that was here that worked, that had been made with care and had not failed when tested. Roan died in the spring of 1897 at the old age of 26, which is a good age for a horse and a testament to the conditions of his care. Eleanor buried him on the south side of the ridge in ground that was by April soft enough to work. She did not get another horse. She was 56 that year and had no pressing need to move faster than her own feet could take her, and the thought of another horse in Roan's stable produced in her a resistance she chose to respect rather than override. She kept the stable. Briggs's apprentices used it sometimes as a shelter when they were working on the Upper Ridge projects. She did not mind. The winter of 1929 came to Coldwater Flats with the measured authority of a thing that has been coming for a long time and is not in a hurry. Eleanor felt it in her joints before she felt it in the air. She was 78 years old, and her body had developed the sensitivity to cold that years of careful attention to cold will produce a kind of fluency with the language of temperature that she had first learned from Thomas's journals and had spent 40 years refining. She felt the pressure change. She felt the specific quality of the air on the morning of the first hard cold, and she recognized it the way you recognize an old acquaintance, not with alarm because she had prepared for it, but with the quiet acknowledgement of something known. She put a log on the stove. She turned the tap and let the water run warm over her hand for a moment, the spring still flowing at 52 degrees, exactly as it had flowed the day she first found it, exactly as Thomas had written that it would. She made coffee. She sat at the table with Thomas's journals, the full set worn now to a suppleness that felt like fabric rather than paper, and she read the entries she had read more times than she could count. They will call it madness because it is easier to mock what one does not understand than to question one's own assumptions. The question, Eleanor, is never what they think of us. The question is whether the earth behaves as we understand it to behave. She set the journal down. She looked at the south-facing window, the glass she had installed in the summer of 1889, replaced once in 1908 when a falling branch from the hillside above had cracked the original, but otherwise the same window, the same orientation, the same angle of winter light that had come through it every December for 40 years. The valley below was quiet. The new homes on the hillsides caught the early light. Not all earth-sheltered, the town had grown past the point of uniformity, but enough of them that the ridge above Coldwater Flats had a different profile than it had in 1889. The profile of a community that had learned something from a hard lesson and had chosen to remember it. She slept that night in the chair by the stove, as she sometimes did in the deep cold, the journal in her lap. In the morning, Briggs's eldest daughter, a woman of 42 who had grown up hearing the story and had taken on the practical role of checking on Eleanor through the winter months, came up the ridge and found the cabin as it always was warm, the tap running, the lamp burned low, the stove with a morning's worth of coals banked and ready. Eleanor Voss was in her chair with the journal open on her lap and her hands folded over it in the particular stillness of a person who has finished what they came to do. She was 78 years old. She had not been cold. The whole county came, not as a figure of speech, as a fact. They came from Coldwater Flats and from the Valley Farms and from the neighboring towns that had heard the story over 40 years in the accumulated way that certain stories accumulate, in attaching themselves to the landscape and the people until they are indistinguishable from the place itself. They came because Eleanor Voss had saved 27 of their parents and grandparents, and because she had taught an entire community to build differently and think differently, and because the name Voss on the hillside was as much a part of this landscape as the ridge itself. They buried her in the town cemetery in the January ground that her neighbors broke with the specific tools she would have approved of, the right tools used in the right way, with the right understanding of what they were for. Eli Mercer, 69 years old, stood at the graveside in his good coat and held his hat and did not speak during the service, because he had found that he could not and had given up pretending otherwise. He stood quietly and let the words that others said move past him, and he thought about a 7-year-old boy in the door of a hillside cabin, the warmth coming out of it like a fact about the world, and a woman's voice asking, "What do you need?" and the simple, impossible completeness of being given it. Calhoun Briggs was dead by then. He had gone in 1921 at 76 with his sketchbook on the nightstand and a half-drawn modification to the Voss roof design on the top page. His son carried the sketchbook to the funeral and showed it to Eleanor, who had looked at it for a long time, and then said quietly, "He improved it. That was the right change." His son had wept, and she had let him. The following spring, the town placed the bronze plaque beside Eleanor's door. It was Eli Mercer who wrote the text because they asked him to, and because he understood that the text had to be precise, that Eleanor Voss had been a precise woman who would not have wanted her story softened into sentiment, who would have wanted the record to reflect what had actually happened and why, without embellishment and without apology. He wrote it, and they cast it, and they mounted it on the stone beside the heavy oak door that was 40 years later, still hanging on its original iron hinges, still fitted tight in its frame, still sealed against the cold, with the pine pitch and tallow mixture that Eleanor had applied with her own hands in December of 1889. It read Ada Thornton, 1851 to 1929. They called it madness. She proved it wisdom. When pride failed and civilization froze, she listened to the earth, and it gave her shelter. From this sanctuary built with knowledge and courage, she saved 27 souls and the future of this town. She taught us that the wisest home is not built against nature, but within it. The door behind the plaque faced south, catching the winter light, the way Eleanor had positioned it to catch the winter light in 1889, the way Thomas had drawn it on the blueprint in 1885, the way the sun and the earth and the basic physics of warmth retention had operated since long before either of them was born. The water inside still ran. The spring had not stopped in 40 years. It had not stopped in 40 years after that. It was still running when the town designated the site a protected landmark in the decade that followed, still running when the first historians came to document. It's still running on the winter mornings when the elementary school children from Coldwater Flats were brought up the ridge on field trips to see the place where their town had been saved, where they stood in the small warm room and turned the brass tap and felt the water and tried to understand what 40 below zero meant and could not quite because they were warm and safe and the earth was holding them up exactly as it had always been calculated to do. The last thing Eleanor Voss had written in her own journal, not Thomas's her own, the small one she had begun in the autumn of 1889 and filled across 40 years, was not a long entry. It was a single line written in the steady hand of a woman who had spent her life doing difficult things until they became natural. The earth held. It always held. Thomas was right. I was right. The work was right. And then beneath it, in the same hand, with what must have been the last of the lamp's light, build within it, not against it. Tell them that. Tell everyone that. Outside the window, the January wind moved over Sentinel Ridge in the way it had always moved, enormous, patient, indifferent, ancient. The snow came down as it had always come down, in the way of something that has no opinion about what it covers or what it reveals, that accumulates according to physics and pressure and the specific geometry of the hillside that piles against the stone face of the cabin and rises above the window ledge and closes over the sod roof and becomes, in the mathematics of insulation and warmth retention, not an enemy, but a blanket, not a grave, a shelter. A home built by a woman who listened to the earth when everyone else was arguing with the sky, who read a dead man's journal by lamplight and found in it not just a blueprint, but a truth, who drove the first iron stake into the ground of Sentinel Ridge in the summer of 1889, with the patience of someone beginning a conversation with a place that has been there a very long time and will be there a very long time after. The conversation continued. The earth held. Preparation is not paranoia. It is the highest form of respect for a world that is older, stronger, and far less forgiving than human pride. And sometimes the person everyone calls crazy is the only one seeing clearly enough to save them.